Great.
Great.
Welcome.
Thanks.
Hello, Francesca. It's great to see you. Thank you for being with us here today. So I wondered if we could just start our conversation with just a little bit of information about who you are, Francesca Moody Productions, maybe a little bit about your background, that kind of thing.
Yeah, of course. So as Lucy says, my name's Francesca Moody. I run a commercial production company, very originally named Francesca Moody Productions. We develop new work, new plays, new musicals, and we'll be also running our own festival this year, but I won't talk about that. My background is I've got a real potted history as a producer, so I fell into producing by accident. I fell in love with theatre at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival in Scotland. I went there when I was 17, and sort of that started a kind of long love affair with a style of making work that is kind of new, urgent, scrappy, small. And I went and independently produced for a number of years, and then subsequently worked for a new writing touring theatre company called Payne's Plough, where I guess I learnt my craft, my dramaturgical kind of skills. And then I went and worked very briefly for another kind of subsidised arts organisation called Curious Directive, and then I set up Francesca Moody Productions. And we are very well known in the industry for developing shows that start as very small things and grow into much bigger things. I'm probably best known as the original producer of a show called Fleabag, which obviously went on from a tiny little show at the Edinburgh Fringe to a big show in the West End and a very successful 2-season television series on Amazon and BBC. I'm also very well known as the original producer of Baby Reindeer, which came out this year and has also been hugely successful as a television series. So we've sort of become, our kind of USP has become that kind of thing, like small stories growing into bigger things that then move into other mediums. But I also develop musicals as well, and I have produced a couple of musicals to full production. One of them is up here on the screen. It's called Cathy and Stella Solve a Murder. Again, it's a show that started its life as a very, very small 5-hander at the Edinburgh Fringe and grew into a bigger production and then a bigger production and then eventually ended up in the West End in a 16-week run at the Ambassadors Theatre. So again, like proving the point that the kind of work that we make is nurturing tiny things into much bigger things. So yeah, and I'm just obsessed with new work, with new stories. It's contemporary, and I think I'm in the business of developing original IP rather than taking existing IP and adapting it. That's what we do. Is that helpful?
That's absolutely fantastic. Thank you. And so Francesca's touched on two of the many reasons why we really wanted Francesca to come and speak to us today. The first is a conversation around original IP, which I think is, as you say, your USP, is to take new ideas and to create that IP along with developing the show. And the other thing that I think you do absolutely fantastically is take very small projects and grow them. And so they're two things that we particularly, I think, want to talk about today in the context of Swedish musical theatre, new musical theatre. But the first question I wanted to ask you, Francesca, was that I feel like in recent years we've seen a real shift in the kinds of stories that we're seeing happening in the West End, let's say, particularly as an example. Different themes, different styles. I wondered if you could speak a little bit about content and what are the ways in which content is now changing and new shows that are becoming successes, how are they different to perhaps 10 years ago, 20 years ago?
I think we were talking a bit about this last night, weren't we? I think the most obvious thing to say is that different people are making musicals now, and so that means the work is different, and that's exciting because I always think, as producers, we're kind of in the business of audiences, so we need to be audience focused, and I think there are two kind of concurrent strands of work that are happening kind of commercially, certainly in London. One of them is the kind of work that I'm making, which is the kind of Kathy and Stella end, or the Operation Mincemeat, or the Six. And then the other end is the kind of, or even Benjamin Button, which won its Olivier on Sunday. And then there's the big kind of bold IP-led musicals, which also have their home in the ecosystem, I think. But I think it's really about who's making the work at the moment, and I do think there's this trend of like younger, hungrier, more contemporary kind of storytellers, producers, creatives, composers coming up just by virtue of the fact that there's a new generation making work. And so I think that there's certainly a shift in the type of content that is coming on stage. But I think, for me, what I think audiences are really looking for right now is to be entertained. And I think sometimes people really forget that entertainment is actually what we are in the business of doing. And like the work is so important, but if we aren't considering our audiences, if we aren't considering the fact that they are spending their time and their money to come to the theatre, and therefore they need an opportunity to be challenged, to have an opportunity for escapism and to be entertained, then kind of what's the point, really? And of course, that's sort of self-serving in the sense that if people are going to be entertained, they're going to be more likely to spend their money. So when you're in the business of commercial theatre, that feels like the obvious thing to be thinking about, but you'll be kind of surprised how many people don't necessarily consider it. So I'm sort of going on, but you're sort of going on a kind of meandering answer to your question about content. So it's more about my kind of ethos in the sense that actually you can be entertaining and you can be, I think you can be entertaining without being populist. You know, whilst also acknowledging that there is a place for populist work in the West End. But yeah, I think, you know, you're right in your question, Lucy. You know, there are a bunch of musicals that have come up recently that are much more driven by ideas around like politics and diversity, social politics, and are telling stories through a much more contemporary lens. And I think that's just about who's making work to a certain extent.
No, that's really, really helpful. And we were talking a little bit yesterday, weren't we, about the idea of people being interested in real people's stories, which actually I kind of feel like Benjamin Button is actually even a version of that. Would you speak a little bit to that as a theme?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and I can use, I can definitely use Kathy and Stella as a bit of an example. So, Kathy and Stella, for anybody who doesn't know the musical, is a true crime murder mystery comedy musical about two girls from Hull, which is in the north of England, who have a terrible true crime podcast that no one listens to, but they find a sense of purpose in it and in their friendship for each other. And then somebody comes to town, gets murdered, and they kind of go on this journey to solve the murder. But really the musical is about these two outsiders, these two people who have never quite fit in, these people who feel quite real, to women. And I think, you know, part of Kathy and Stella's success and part of the reason that people fell in love with the musical is because it's about two characters who loads of people can identify with. And you know, on the bigger end, you know, we were talking about Standing at the Sky's Edge, you know, big musical, which in many ways is a kind of interesting one because it's almost like a concept album musical, but again about real people, real lives, and from a very super specific place as well. So there is something about specificity as well that I think is important. Like when you're making any work, to be perfectly honest, but certainly with musical theatre, we shouldn't be frightened to develop stories that have a real sense of specificity about them, because in their specificity there is accessibility, and there is often like a point of connection in themes, you know, whether that's musicals or theatre, to be perfectly honest with you. So I think people want to see themselves on stage. They want to see their stories played out on stage. We always talk about new work being an opportunity to kind of reflect back to people what's happening in the world, talk about ideas around things that people are engaging with right now. And so I think the most exciting, interesting and easiest way to do that is through that to a certain extent as well, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And I think Standing at the Sky's Edge is a really interesting example because it was set in Sheffield, which is my home city. And I think even at the time, everybody sort of went, well, but it's a very Sheffield story. But actually then it goes into London. It has this massive, worldwide life, and the themes are just so universal.
Yeah, it's about, love and death and life and family and class and like all of those things I think are things that people can relate to in some way. So you can see why it was so successful for that reason, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to talk a little bit about, and you've touched on this already, Francesca, but about models of creating new work. And when we were first talking about this session, we were making an observation that projects like Operation Mincemeat and actually the processes you've talked about with some of your shows, these are projects that grow and develop from very, very tiny, small-scale pieces of work, and they grow and grow and grow over a very, very long period of time. And this is a completely different model to making new musical theatre, I think. And something about that really spoke to me in terms of the landscape in Sweden and the potential to kind of grow small work, and how do we do that? How do we create the ecosystem that grows things from a tiny beginning to a kind of bigger scale, or the right scale for the piece? I wondered if you would talk just a little bit about that, kind of how do you find those projects to start with, and then that process of how do you grow them and support them?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of how I find the projects, I mean, I guess like lots of people here who are producers or creators, directors, the projects come to me in loads of different ways. But the thing that makes me throw myself full body at something is that like kind of gut instinct towards a story that I really, really love. I think probably most people here are familiar with the fact that, musical theatre takes, as you say, however you develop it, a really, really long time to make. You've got to be in it for the long game, and that means you've got to really love the story and love the idea. And so so for me, it's really about that, and all the obvious things, which is like building my relationships with artists, making sure that I'm consuming culture in the right kind of ways, going to see work, and being inspired as a producer, in the pursuit of finding new work. In terms of that kind of development process and as you were saying, Lucy, the kind of, I think for me it's about like reimagining how we make musicals, how we make new work. So we, historically there's been a very kind of tried and tested kind of approach to developing musicals, I think. You have an idea, or someone pitches you something, you like it, you commission them, they write a bit, you do a workshop, you do another workshop, you bring some more people in, you do another workshop, you bring some funders in, you do it, you do it that way until you get to a full production. What's interesting about musicals like Six, Operation Mincemeat, Benjamin Button, Cathy and Stella, is that they are reimagining that kind of development process. So again, not to talk too much about my work, but the Cathy and Stella model is very, very different because and very similar to Operation Mincemeat, actually. It is a model where you go, I love this idea, you develop it a bit, and then you get a slot to present it before it's finished. And then instead of spending a long, long time developing something, you force it into existence really, really quickly, and you put it on stage in front of an audience, and you use that as your workshop opportunity. You use it as a branding exercise. You use it as a way to build momentum around the show and bring other people into the process. So instead of going through kind of a series of workshops where you need to find money each time to develop them, you actually treat it as a production very early on, and you use that feedback from the audience in order to help drive the kind of next phase of development. And I think we were also talking yesterday about funding and that kind of model of funding, and how one might go about kind of developing a new musical in a more unconventional fashion. And I think what I said to you yesterday was that the way I feel is like personally anybody who relies on public funding in order to make work is foolish, because whilst public funding is a really fantastic thing to have access to, in the UK we do not have a huge level of access to public funding in the ways that we used to now. The Arts Council's there, it's brilliant, it's not going to fund every project, and so as commercial producers or independent producers, we have to reimagine and think of ways that we might bring those shows into existence by being kind of super entrepreneurial and having that kind of sense of hustle around creating work. And that means, you know, doing very obvious things like building relationships with funders and investors very early, asking people to come on a journey with you from the beginning, telling them they're not going to make their money back, thinking about, and I know we're going to talk about it a bit, but like in the early stages, telling people, you know, this is not about making your money right now. This is about playing the long game. And you know, from my perspective, from FMP's perspective, that is obviously I'm finding that conversation easier and easier because I've proved my point multiple times. But doing that and also thinking about those kind of collaborations that you can make, those partnerships. I learned a very long time ago when I worked at Paynes Plough that we are much, much stronger when we co-produce work together. We can share resources and ideas. And so thinking about those kind of opportunities for partnership much earlier in the process, bringing people in, not being so, I guess, cloak and dagger about how you make your work, bringing people in at the right moments in order to kind of galvanize a journey for something. So yeah, I think certainly in the UK, like our models for developing new musicals are really changing. Mine is a very, very specific perspective on it because I have a history of developing work at the Edinburgh Fringe and because that feels like a real playground for new work for me, and it feels like a place to kind of build a brand. But there are also a whole host of like really amazing other ways of developing work that isn't just the conventional apply for some funding, do a workshop, find a co-producer, put the show on, as well. Whether that be through kind of new musical showcases like Beam, or you know, tapping into like musical theatre networks. Like there's just so much in the UK that sort of helps us reimagine that kind of process of developing new work.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you, Francesca. And we're going to hear a little bit more about Beam and the Musical Theatre Network in the next, I think it's the next 2 sessions' time. We're going to hear a little bit more about that and how that all works. I just wanted to ask you, I just want to pick up on one thing, which this is quite a nuts and bolts question, and it's also a leading question. So I'm just going to put that on the table. Okay. I want to be really precise when we talk about growing a show, about the venues that involves, because you're talking about perhaps, you know, I think you used the word pushing something into existence quite early and quite quickly. And what are the scale of those venues? Because you're talking about potentially starting something at the Fringe and then getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And you all know where I'm headed with this in terms of infrastructure and venues and what's available to us in Sweden. But could you just talk us through what are those actual numbers? And then I guess the second part of that question is about investment. And then how do you say to an investor, this venue is only however many 100 seats, come with me on this journey?
Yeah, of course. So again, I'll use Cafe and Cellar as an example because it's mine. It started its life as a small 5-person musical, one man on a piano in an 168-seat theatre at the Edinburgh Fringe in the Round. Which, if anyone cares, doing a musical in the Round, I would not advise. But it worked. It was fine. We survived it. We survived it on a budget. And you know, in terms of numbers, I'm very happy to talk about like the cost of things. So the cost of producing that in 2022 was £70,000. £70,000. Yeah. So really cheap for a 5-person musical at the Fringe. There was no set, I might add. The next year, we bring it back into what I think of as a much bigger version, change it to an end-on, take it back to the Edinburgh Fringe in a bigger theatre that is 400 seats, which is at the big end for Edinburgh. But we built up the brand enough and the fizz around it, and Edinburgh is a very. This question is not about Edinburgh, but it's a very specific market, and it's a discovery market. So your audience is already there to find something. So if you make a show that you know people are going to want to come to, that's like half the battle in Edinburgh. You're not having to convince them to stop watching Netflix or going out for dinner, basically. And from that, we then went into a kind of what I would call a regional tour, 2 regional sit-downs in 2 really beautiful theatres, one in Bristol Old Vic, and one in Manchester, and they were both sort of 500-seat theatres. And that production was all one thing, but we sort of developed between Edinburgh and the 2 tour venues, and turned it from a 90-minute 1-act version into a 2-act, 2-hour, 20-minute version with an interval. In very quick succession, and the whole of that cost £500,000. And then we took it to the West End, and in the West End we took it to the Ambassadors Theatre, which is one of the smaller houses in the West End, and that was a 500-seat theatre. And we really only have kind of, 1, 2, 3, 4 theatres which in the West End, which I think of as at that scale, sort of between the sort of top end of 400 and sort of 600, which for new work is perfect because you're still building IP, you're still building a sense of it being something for the long term. And again, I don't need to say something as obvious as this, but I will. But having a packed out theatre and selling out your show is like the easiest way to prove that it has like longevity. So smaller capacities are always going to be more valuable in that sense as well. And then when we did it in the West End, it cost 1.2 million. And some of those development costs are the £70,000 and the £500,000 they were actually rolled in. So that's the like whole cost of producing the musical over 4 years. And actually for a musical, that's quite quick to make a musical, as I'm sure most people here will realise. I think that when you're talking to so to answer your first bit about kind of investors, when you're talking to potential investors and funders about, what it means to kind of put their money in at this stage in order to make their money at that end, it's just about convincing people that everyone here knows musicals, it's a long tail for musicals. Developing musicals is not about making money like that. Musicals are really expensive, and actually the kind of long tail of a musical from a producer's perspective is, yes, it's about success in a theatre, and it's about making money and potentially making profit, but it is also about licensing, about non-replica productions, about cast albums. And so there is, when you're talking about smaller capacities, I think it's talking about how you are building a brand for something when you're in the business of making new work, where you're building IP of something, you're building an audience, and that takes a really, really long time, and that means that the money might not necessarily come back as quickly. But what I would say to you about kind of scale of venue is that, when it comes to new work, like the smaller capacities are better. And I from talking to you a little bit, I understand that there's a similar, maybe even a bigger problem here, or a challenge, I'd say, rather than problem, about scale of venue for that kind of work. Because in the UK, in the West End, there really are only 2 West End theatres that are sort of 500 seats, and both of them have long-running musicals in them right now. So for a producer like me, who makes that kind of work, it's really, really hard or challenging. And so there's this kind of sense of like, how do we reimagine commerciality? Like, what are the other ways that we can make our work feel commercial? So again, sorry that I've sort of meandered around your question ever so slightly. But
no, that's actually, I found that super helpful. I don't know if you did. It was absolutely great. Can I just loop back a little bit? You've talked about investment and that journey that you take investors on. Could you talk us a little bit through that kind of investment strategy? Who is putting money into these shows? How are you finding these people? And I recognise that's probably a very, very big question, but I'd just be very interested to know.
Cool. I think investors come in all shapes and sizes. From the big end to the small end. I think what they share often in common is their passion for theatre, and often their passion for you as an individual. I was telling a story last night about one of my investors who I had a show on in London recently, a play, and I did a kind of an evening for like current investors who weren't necessarily invested in that show, potential new people. And he came along and he said to me, really the shows that I invest in, I only really invest in two kinds of shows. I invest in shows that I like, the ones that I like the content, and then it depends who's asking me. And that really struck me because I was like, oh yes, like the relationship you build with an investor over time is so important. So in terms of raising money and investment, it's like a lifelong journey, and it's a kind of almost like a full-time job for a producer, I think. And it's really about understanding that investors lead to investors, and that there are these concentric circles of people who want to support work, want to invest in work. And I think investors are really interested in, making money. Maybe making money. Making money is important. Definitely getting their money back if they can. Being part of something extraordinary. Having a fantastic anecdote at the dinner table, which is important. Going to the press nights sounds so obvious, and to all of us, that feels like just bread and butter. But for people who don't work in theatre, it's so exciting to be at a press night. And I think the other thing that has helped me really build up my relationships with my investors is understanding that, investment is a two-way street. Not just in the sense of like, you give me your money, I report to you on how your money's been spent and whether you've made your money back or lost it or just you're getting it back, but also like everybody wants something else from the relationship, and it's about finding out what that thing is. So it, like, if you're a people person like me, investing and raising money from investment is like really fun because you just get to make loads and loads of friends. So yeah, that's sort of more holistic approach to kind of the investment. And obviously the more time you spend building relationships with investors, the sort of easier it becomes to have a conversation with an investor about investing in the work super early on, when we know that the money's not coming back, but it might come back 5 years down the line. So that becomes a much easier kind of process generally in terms of investment. But yeah, it's about the hustle, Lucy, as well. It's just about going out and the balance and the right balance of how do you ask someone for money. But I do love the honest exchange of raising investment, because having gone through a kind of experience of working, in the subsidised sector in the UK and relying really heavily on public funding, and now having moved into this kind of more commercial way of making work, like there is so much in the UK. I can't speak for here, but in the UK, you spend so much time writing funding applications, and then off they go, and then 10% of the time you get the money. If you're talking about investors or even donors, to be perfectly honest with you, you go out for a coffee, you ask them for money, they say yes, they say no, you move on. It's as simple as that, and it's more fun, it's less time consuming, and potentially you reap bigger rewards in the end, in my opinion. So yeah.
Oh, that's super helpful. Thank you so much, Francesca. I'm getting nudged by Kat. I think we've got about 5 minutes, maybe, if I'm lucky. I could talk to you all morning. Thank you so much. But I really wanted to open out to the floor. I would love it if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask Francesca just in these last few minutes.
Just very
Julian.
My friend David here, another David, who speaks perfect English, whispered to me, what is IP? I know what it is. Could you just say IP?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
IP is intellectual property, so something original that's been created. So yeah, Kathy and Stella's original IP now.
Yeah, thank you. I'd not thought of that. Thank you very much.
That's one.
Oh, hello, David.
Another David.
Another David. You can only ask a question if you're called David.
Sorry about that. I just wanted to ask you, this is a kind of reflection of some of the conversations I have with Swedish writers and Swedish producers and creators, which is that there's a common thread that people feel like, I have a vision in my head that I want another Swedish musical in the West End in the next 10 years, please. So how are we going to make that happen? And a lot of the time when I'm talking about stories, people say, oh yes, but this story is so Swedish, it couldn't go to the UK. It's too Swedish, people wouldn't understand. And I just wanted to ask what you felt about, because there was something about what you said about specificity. I can't say it. Right. Like, for example, I mean, Swedish detective novels are incredibly popular in the UK. Well, worldwide, actually, but some of the best and most loved TV series, and, you know, the Braun and Borgen, and, I mean, they're both Danish, but... but do you understand?
Yeah.
Can you talk to us about whether Swedishness would be off-putting to a British audience?
I don't think so. No, I mean, it's so... I just think, like I said before, I just think it's all about the story, right? If it's a great story, I mean, you know, genre sells in particular. I think people like something that they know, they understand what the structures of something are, which is why with Kathy and Stella, when you said it's a true crime murder mystery, like people are like, yes, I know what that is. Oh, and it's a comedy as well. But I think there's definitely a place for Swedish stories in the West End, because if it's a good story about real people from a very specific point of view, like there will be accessibility there in the story for anyone, in my opinion.
Thank you so much. So,
have we got any other questions? Yes, Shell.
Yes, I wonder, I mean, here in Sweden we have still quite good public funding from the government. You're ahead of us in recline, you see it coming. And I wonder, these donors and investors, do they get some tax breaks, or do you have some other tax laws in Britain that we don't, because we don't have it here?
Did everybody hear that question?
Yeah, I can answer it to a certain extent. The short answer is there's no tax break. The donors, if they're donating to a charity, they'll get a tax break. What we do have there are two things in the UK. One that I haven't done, which is there's like a kind of investment scheme called EIS or SEIS, where you can, and that's for any kind of business, but producers have done it through theatre, where you sort of raise for a kind of slate of work, and then people get a tax break on that. What we do have in the UK that's really amazing is we have a theatre tax credit, which is an amazing thing that, in my opinion, keeps galvanizing work, particularly like mine, which is a tax credit on pre-production costs. So it's a tax credit of 45% on 80% of the pre-production costs. It's a lot of money back, basically. Brings down the recoupment really quickly, or it allows kind of smaller independent producers to start their next project. So that's what we do have, yeah. But, yeah.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Maybe we've got time for 1 more. 2 minutes. We've got 2 minutes. Come on. We can do this. Yes, Tord.
Yeah, you talked about how much Kathy and Stella grew from the Fringe to West End in terms of money. How much did you grow, like people on stage? You said it was 4?
Oh yeah, so it started out as 5 people, then it went up to 7, and then it went to 10, but that was including the offstage swings. And then and in the first year it was just a man with a piano, and then it went up to a band of 4, and that stayed for the, yeah. It definitely grew in terms of people, because we were very kind of, in that first iteration, we were very, very small, kind of our music director, composer, supervisor, and pianist were all the same person. You know, and our choreographer is also our co-director. So, you know, we kept the original team all the way through, and we added people like a kind of music supervisor, and an orchestrator. But yeah, at that point we were very small. So yeah, sort of went from something like, I guess 12 people working on the show, including artists and creatives, to something like 45, 50 people. Yeah. Which
Tord.
is, yeah.
Sorry, I was
No,
going
no,
to say,
fine.
Tord, thank you. That was the perfect 2-minute question. So you have the. Yeah. So I'd just like to say thank you so much, Francesca. That was absolutely extraordinary to hear from you. Thank you. And as David said, we do have, Francesca is very happy to meet people at the end of the day in our speed networking sessions. And there's a sign-up sheet down at the end of the room, as David said. And also do please just grab Francesca. I know she'd be really happy to meet all of you and talk to all of you at any time. So thank you, Francesca.